I lost her because I was afraid.
The woman they mocked is now untouchable.
I am sorry, Amara. I love you so much. Please come back.
She's acting like a queen now because people are blind. Hurry up, girls. We have a lot of work to do tonight. How did you get this number? You cared more about powerful people than me.
The morning after the Winter Imperial Gala, Seoul woke up obsessed with one woman. Every major entertainment page, luxury fashion account, celebrity news channel, and business magazine carried the same image across their front pages. Amara Okoye standing at the top of the crystal staircase in that obsidian black gown, while an entire ballroom stared at her in stunned silence. Some headlines called her the ghost designer of Seoul. Others called her the Black Queen of Couture. But the phrase that spread fastest across social media was simpler and far more dangerous. The woman they mocked became untouchable. By sunrise, clips from the gala had already reached millions of views internationally. Fashion bloggers in Paris dissected her gown stitch by stitch. Luxury editors in Milan demanded interviews. American celebrities publicly begged for custom house of obsidian pieces. And inside the Laurent penthouse overlooking the Han River, Damien Laurent sat alone in silence, watching her face replay across giant television screens, while something inside his chest slowly began collapsing beneath the weight of regret he could no longer ignore. The interview clip repeated again. Amara standing calmly near the ballroom windows, city lights glowing behind her like a second crown, her voice steady and composed as the reporter asked how she built such an empire, after starting with almost nothing. Because people are most dangerous, she answered softly, after they survive being treated like they are nothing. Damien muted the television immediately afterward, but the sentence continued echoing through his mind anyway. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing at the top of that staircase again. Not broken, not nervous, not small, powerful, beautiful, untouchable. The same woman he once mocked for daring to dream too loudly had walked into Seoul's most elite ballroom and silenced 500 powerful people without raising her voice once. Damien leaned back against the couch slowly and rubbed tired hands over his face. Across the room, Celeste Moreau stood near the kitchen island, scrolling through social media with increasing irritation. Every platform was flooded with Amara. Fashion pages reposted her endlessly. Luxury brands quoted her interview. Celebrities followed House of Obsidian publicly. Even women who once ignored Amara during high society events were now posting paragraphs praising her vision, elegance, and strength. Celeste's jaw tightened harder with every post she read. "This is insane," she muttered finally. Damien said nothing. Celeste looked up sharply. "Are you listening to me?" He glanced toward her slowly. "Yes. No, you're not." Her voice sharpened. "The entire internet is acting like she's some kind of goddess." Damien looked back toward the muted television screen where Amara's image still glowed beneath luxury headlines. Maybe they're not wrong. The room became silent instantly. Celeste stared at him in disbelief. "Excuse me?" Damien realized too late what he had said aloud. But the truth had already escaped. Because somewhere beneath all the arrogance and pride he spent years building around himself, he knew something now with horrifying clarity. Amara had always possessed greatness. He had simply been too cowardly to stand beside it once society disapproved. Celeste laughed coldly and tossed her phone onto the marble counter. "Unbelievable," she snapped. "After everything she did, you still look at her like that." Damien frowned immediately. "What exactly did she do?" "Oh, please." Celeste crossed her arms tightly. "Don't act innocent now. She embarrassed us publicly." Damien looked at her carefully for several long seconds before speaking quietly. "No, we embarrassed ourselves." Celeste's face hardened. "You're defending her?" "I'm stating facts." He stood slowly from the couch and walked toward the enormous windows overlooking Seoul. Morning sunlight reflected against the river below. while news helicopters moved across the skyline in the distance. Somewhere out there, Amara was beginning a life completely beyond his reach. And for the first time since their divorce, Damen finally understood something painful enough to hollow him from the inside. Losing her had not been a mistake. It had been the biggest failure of his entire life. Meanwhile, across Seoul, the atmosphere inside House of Obsidian headquarters felt almost electric. Assistants rushed through white marble hallways carrying fabric portfolios and scheduling tablets, while phones rang non-stop from international buyers desperate for appointments. Fashion journalists waited outside the building, hoping for even a glimpse of Amara entering or leaving. Since the gala reveal, House of Obsidian's value had nearly tripled overnight. Investors from Paris and Dubai offered partnerships worth hundreds of millions. Luxury department stores competed viciously for distribution rights. Every elite woman in Seoul suddenly wanted access to the brand that had humiliated high society without saying a word. And at the center of the chaos stood Amara herself, calm as ever. She walked through the atelier wearing a fitted black designer suit with structured shoulders and gold detailing. Her natural curls swept elegantly into a sleek low bun while assistants hurried nervously behind her trying to keep pace. She looked less like someone recovering from years of humiliation and more like someone born to command empires. Paris Fashion Week confirmed, one assistant announced breathlessly while following beside her. And Vogue wants an exclusive interview. Decline it politely, Amara replied without slowing. Also, 2 royal families requested private fittings. Schedule them next month. There's also a waiting list for custom gowns now extending. Almost 14 months, Amara stopped briefly near a mannequin draped in unfinished midnight silk. Raise prices again. The assistant blinked in surprise. Again? Amara adjusted the fabric carefully herself before replying calmly. If access becomes too easy, desire disappears. The assistant nodded immediately and hurried away. Amara remained alone for a moment beside the mannequin, while sunlight poured softly through enormous atelier windows. 5 years ago, she had cried quietly inside a leaking apartment, wondering whether survival itself would be enough. Now the fashion world moved according to her decisions. But strangely, success had not made her feel loud inside. It made her feel peaceful. That frightened people far more. Because women who needed revenge could still be manipulated emotionally. Women who had healed completely became impossible to control. Her phone vibrated once against the marble work table nearby. Unknown number. She almost ignored it before finally answering calmly. Hello? Silence. Then Damien's voice. Amara. Everything inside the room seemed to still slightly around her. Not because hearing him hurt anymore, but because once upon a time, that voice had controlled entire parts of her emotional world. Now it sounded distant, almost unfamiliar. How did you get this number? She asked quietly. Damen exhaled softly on the other end. That's your first question? It's the only relevant one. Silence stretched briefly between them. Finally he spoke again. You looked... He stopped himself. You looked incredible last night. Amara's expression never changed. Was there a reason you called? Damen leaned heavily against the glass windows of his penthouse while loosening his tie slowly. He had rehearsed dozens of things to say since waking up. Apologies, explanations, regret. But hearing her voice again destroyed all preparation instantly, because she sounded different now, stronger, colder, untouchable in ways that terrified him. I wanted to congratulate you, he said finally. You built something extraordinary. Amara remained quiet for several seconds before replying softly. I remember when you called it nonsense. The words hit like knives because they were true. Damen closed his eyes briefly. Amara, I'm busy. Please. Her silence after that single word almost hurt more than shouting would have. Damen swallowed hard. I know I don't deserve your time, he admitted quietly. But I need you to know something. Amara waited calmly. I was wrong about you. She almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny. Because of how painfully small the sentence sounded compared to everything she survived. No, she replied softly. You were weak. Damen felt the truth of that statement settle brutally inside his chest. Maybe. You cared more about powerful people accepting you than protecting the person who loved you. Her voice remained calm. That's not strength, Damen. That's cowardice. Silence crushed the line afterward. Damien stared out across Seoul while memories flooded him violently. Every dinner where he allowed people to insult her. Every moment he stayed quiet while society humiliated her to protect his reputation. Every cruel sentence he delivered because powerful men around him expected it. God, she was right. He had loved her once, but not courageously enough. Amara, he whispered brokenly. But she interrupted him gently. I don't hate you anymore. Those words should have comforted him. Instead, they terrified him completely, because hatred still contained emotion, passion, attachment. But the calmness in her voice now sounded like freedom. Take care of yourself, Damien. Then the call ended. He stood motionless for a long time afterward, staring at the dead phone screen, while something sharp and unbearable twisted slowly inside his chest. Across the city, Amara placed her phone down beside sketches and continued reviewing fabric selections as though the conversation had barely touched her emotionally at all. And maybe it truly hadn't. Because healing had changed her in ways Damien still could not understand. She no longer needed him to validate her worth. No longer needed apologies from people who watched her suffer comfortably. No longer needed revenge either. Success had already spoken loudly enough. 3 nights later, House of Obsidian hosted its first private runway presentation since the gala reveal. The event took place inside a restored art museum overlooking the Han River, transformed entirely into black marble, soft gold lighting, and floating crystal installations resembling shattered stars. Invitations were nearly impossible to obtain. Billionaires, actresses, royalty, and fashion editors flew into Seoul from around the world hoping for attendance. Outside the venue, photographers crowded behind barriers while black luxury cars arrived endlessly beneath flashing lights. Damien stood inside the crowd near the back of the room, feeling strangely invisible for the first time in his life. Years earlier, events like this revolved around him automatically. Now nobody cared he was there. Every conversation focused entirely on Amara. She changed luxury fashion completely. House of Obsidian made Paris nervous. I heard her net worth doubled this month alone. They say she personally rejects clients she dislikes. Damien listened silently, while guilt hollowed him further from the inside. Then suddenly the room darkened. Music slowed, and Amara appeared at the end of the runway wearing a black sculpted gown that looked less designed than forged from darkness itself. The audience actually stopped breathing for a moment. She walked slowly through soft golden light while cameras flashed endlessly around her. But it wasn't only beauty people reacted to anymore. It was power. She radiated it now effortlessly. Every woman in the room wanted to become her. Every man in the room wanted her attention. And Damien simply wanted the impossible. He wanted the woman who once loved him before fear and weakness turned him into someone unworthy of her completely. After the show ended, guests flooded toward Amara hoping for introductions. Damien watched from across the room as politicians, royalty, and billionaires surrounded her with admiration. Then his chest tightened painfully, because another man stepped quietly beside her and gently placed her coat around her shoulders, before she even noticed the temperature dropping. Tall, calm, elegant. He didn't touch her possessively, didn't demand attention. He simply cared for her naturally, as though protecting her comfort was the easiest thing in the world. Amara looked up at him and smiled softly. A real smile, small, warm. Damien felt something inside him break completely at the sight, because years ago she used to smile at him exactly like that, before he taught her love could become humiliation. And standing there beneath soft runway lights while another man quietly gave her the tenderness he once failed to protect, Damien Laurent finally understood the cruelest lesson of his entire life. Sometimes the punishment for cowardice is watching the woman you still love become too extraordinary to ever belong to you again. Damien Laurent stopped sleeping properly after the House of Obsidian runway show. At first he blamed stress, market pressure, investor meetings, international expansion. But deep down he knew the truth. Every night the same image returned the moment his penthouse became quiet enough for memory to speak loudly again. Amara standing beneath golden runway lights while another man gently placed a coat around her shoulders, with the kind of effortless care Damien himself had failed to give her when she needed it most. The image haunted him because it forced him to confront something unbearable. Amara had not simply survived him. She had healed beyond him. And there was nothing more terrifying than realizing the person you hurt no longer needed your apology to move forward beautifully without you. 3 weeks after the runway show, House of Obsidian officially surpassed several legacy luxury brands in global market valuation. Financial magazines called Amara the future of couture. Fashion students studied her designs in universities. Wealthy women began copying her sharp silhouettes and dark minimalist styling so aggressively that entire luxury districts in Seoul transformed aesthetically within months. Black structured gowns, obsidian jewelry, clean, dramatic tailoring. Everything Amara once sketched alone in tiny apartments while people mocked her had now become the standard elite women desperately tried to imitate. The irony tasted bitter in Damien's mouth every time he saw it, because he remembered the night he ruined her sketches beneath running water while telling her she was foolish for dreaming too large. God, if arrogance alone could kill a man, he would have died already. You're distracted again. Damien looked up sharply during the board meeting. One of his senior executives frowned from across the conference table, while financial projections glowed across enormous digital screens behind them. I asked whether we should approve the Tokyo acquisition. Damien blinked slowly, forcing focus back into the room. Approve it, he answered automatically. The executive hesitated. You didn't even review the numbers. Irritation flickered across Damien's expression instantly. Then postpone the discussion until tomorrow. Silence settled heavily across the boardroom. Nobody argued further, but the atmosphere shifted subtly afterward. Damien noticed it immediately. Powerful men recognized weakness in each other faster than anyone else, and lately, weakness followed him everywhere. Later that evening, Damien stood alone inside his office overlooking Seoul, while rain slid down enormous glass windows. The city glowed beneath the storm exactly the same way it had years earlier. During the night, Amara first asked him what would happen if she built her own name instead of surviving beneath his. At the time, he laughed. Now her name carried more cultural influence than his entire business empire. His phone buzzed quietly against the desk. Celeste. Damien stared at the screen without answering immediately. Their relationship had become unbearable after the gala. Every conversation turned bitter within minutes. Celeste hated hearing Amara's name mentioned publicly, which had become impossible to avoid considering Seoul now treated her almost like royalty. Damien answered finally. What? Celeste's voice arrived sharp with irritation. Where are you? Office, again? Damien closed his eyes briefly. What do you want, Celeste? You forgot dinner. He had. Completely. Silence stretched across the call before Celeste spoke again, quieter this time. You're still in love with her. Damien's jaw tightened instantly. Don't start this tonight. You think I can't see it? Her voice cracked slightly beneath anger. You look at her pictures when you think nobody notices. Damien said nothing because denial felt pointless now. Celeste laughed bitterly on the other end. Unbelievable, she whispered. After everything you did to her, you still expected her to love you forever. The sentence hit harder than she intended because somewhere beneath all his pride, Damien knew exactly how deeply he failed Amara. Not only as a husband, as a man. He had watched society humiliate the woman who loved him and joined them because protecting his image mattered more than protecting her heart. It's over, Celeste, he said quietly. Silence, then sharp breathing. What? Damien stared out across the rain-covered skyline. We both know this stopped being real a long time ago. So this is because of her? No, he exhaled slowly. This is because I became someone I can't even respect anymore. Celeste laughed once. Cold. Hurt. You should have figured that out before destroying your wife. Then the call ended. Damien lowered the phone slowly while emptiness spread through the office around him. Across Seoul, Amara sat inside a private rooftop restaurant surrounded by warm candlelight and soft jazz music, while fashion executives from Paris discussed expanding House of Obsidian into Europe permanently. She listened calmly while sipping wine, elegant as always in a fitted black satin dress with gold cuffs framing her wrists. But unlike the nervous woman who once attended elite dinners silently beside Damien, Amara now controlled every room she entered effortlessly. Men listened when she spoke. Women studied her carefully. Nobody interrupted her anymore. At the far end of the table sat the same man Damien noticed during the runway show. Adrian Vale rarely spoke loudly during meetings, yet somehow commanded attention anyway. He was one of Europe's youngest billionaire architects, famous for designing museums, luxury towers, and cultural landmarks across multiple countries before turning 40. But what unsettled people most about Adrian was not his wealth. It was his calmness. He moved through the world like a man with nothing to prove. Tonight he watched Amara quietly while Paris executives argued over launch strategies. Finally, one executive laughed nervously and asked, "How does it feel becoming the most desired woman in luxury fashion?" Several people smiled immediately, waiting for Amara's answer. But Adrian spoke first. "Dangerous question." The table laughed softly. The executive grinned. "Why?" Adrian looked toward Amara calmly. "Because women become terrifying once they realize admiration and love are not the same thing." Silence flickered briefly across the table. Amara's eyes met Adrian's for half a second before she smiled faintly into her wine glass. That tiny interaction alone told everyone at the table there was something quietly powerful growing between them. Not loud attraction, not shallow obsession. Understanding, respect. The kind Damien realized too late mattered far more than temporary passion ever could. Over the following weeks, rumors about Amara and Adrian spread rapidly through elite circles. Paparazzi photographed them leaving art galleries together, dining privately in Paris, attending architecture exhibitions in Tokyo. Unlike Damien, Adrian never positioned himself at the center beside her publicly. He never tried overshadowing her success or turning her into decoration attached to his image. If anything, he seemed proud standing slightly behind her while the world admired her brilliance directly. And somehow that hurt Damien even more. One rainy evening, Damien finally did something he swore he would never do. He visited the old apartment building where Amara once lived after leaving him. The neighborhood looked smaller now, poorer. Narrow streets crowded with tiny restaurants and flickering signs. Damien stepped from his car slowly while rain dampened his dark coat. Years ago, he could never have imagined Amara surviving here alone. Yet somehow she built an empire from these streets while he sat comfortably inside luxury towers believing she needed him. Shame settled heavily inside his chest. The elderly landlady recognized Amara's name immediately when Damien asked about her. "Ah," she smiled warmly. "The designer girl." Damien swallowed. "You knew her?" "Of course." The woman laughed softly. "She worked harder than anyone I ever met." Her expression turned nostalgic. "Sometimes I heard the sewing machine running until sunrise." Damien looked toward the tiny apartment window upstairs, while guilt tightened painfully through him. "Was she unhappy here?" The landlady studied him carefully before answering. "No." Damien frowned slightly. "No?" "Lonely sometimes." She smiled gently, but not unhappy. Then her eyes sharpened slightly. Whatever broke her before she came here, she left stronger than it. Damien could barely breathe after hearing that, because suddenly he pictured Amara inside. Those tiny rooms alone during freezing nights teaching herself luxury construction techniques, while he attended galas with people who laughed at her existence. Openly. God, what kind of man had he been? Later that same week, House of Obsidian announced its largest event yet. An exclusive Paris showcase held inside the restored Palais Garnier attended by royalty, billionaires, celebrities, and international press. The invitation itself became one of the most desired luxury items online. Damien received one unexpectedly 3 days before the event. No personal message attached. Just black paper embossed with silver lettering. House of Obsidian, Paris. For several minutes he simply stared at the invitation silently. Then his assistant entered carefully. "Sir?" Damien looked up slowly. "Cancel my meetings next Thursday. You're attending?" Damien's eyes dropped back toward the invitation. Yes. Because despite everything, the shame, regret, humiliation, and heartbreak slowly destroying him from the inside, one truth remained impossible to escape. He still loved her. Not in the selfish, shallow way he once confused with ownership. Real love, the painful kind arriving too late, the kind forcing him to confront every weakness that cost him the only woman who might have loved him forever, if he had simply been brave enough to protect her when the world turned cruel. And somewhere deep down, Damien already feared what Paris would finally force him to accept completely. Amara Okoye no longer belonged to the past he broke. She belonged to a future far too extraordinary for him to reach anymore. Paris did not welcome Damien Laurent the way Sol once did. In Sol, he used to walk into rooms and feel the shift immediately. Attention bending toward him, conversations adjusting, people measuring themselves against his presence. In Paris, inside the Palais Garnier turned House of Obsidian showcase venue, he felt something entirely different. Indifference. The kind that quietly humiliates powerful men without saying a single word. The building itself had been transformed into a surreal cathedral of fashion. Black marble floors reflected soft golden light from floating chandeliers. Runway platforms extended like sculpted art pieces across the hall. The air carried faint notes of expensive perfume and anticipation, sharp enough to feel physical. Hundreds of guests sat in silence waiting for Amara Okoye to appear. Damien stood near the back of the hall, dressed in a tailored dark suit, blending into the crowd but not belonging to it anymore. He had come alone. No Celeste. No entourage. Just the weight of his own choices following him like a shadow. And then the lights dimmed. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. Slowly, like the world itself was preparing to acknowledge something important. A soft voice echoed through the hall. House of Obsidian, Paris Collection, Eclipse. The runway lit up in a single line of gold. And Amara appeared at the far end. For a moment, Damien forgot where he was. Amara Okoye stood there like she had never been broken by anything in her life. Her skin glowed under controlled lighting, deep brown and luminous. Her natural curls styled into a sleek modern crown that framed her face like sculpture. She wore a structured obsidian black couture gown, sharp at the shoulders, sculpted through the waist, flowing into layered silk that moved like liquid shadow. Fine gold embroidery traced across the fabric in abstract patterns resembling constellations. Every step she took made the dress react like it was alive. She did not walk like someone presenting clothing. She walked like someone who understood she had already become the concept itself. Behind her, models followed wearing variations of her designs, each one telling a different story of power, survival, and rebirth. The audience was completely silent at first. Then came the reactions, whispering, then awe, then disbelief. A famous editor leaned forward and whispered, "She's not designing anymore. She's redefining couture." Damien felt something tighten painfully inside his chest as he watched her move down the runway. Not because she was beautiful, though she was beyond that now, but because of what she represented. Everything he once dismissed had become the center of the world he now watched from the outside. And then he saw Adrian Vale sitting 3 seats ahead of him near the front row. Calm, composed. Watching Amara with quiet focus, not like a man obsessed, but like someone witnessing art he genuinely respected. When Amara reached the midpoint of the runway, she stopped. The music softened. The entire hall waited, and then she spoke. Her voice was calm, controlled, and carried effortlessly across the hall without microphone distortion. "They once told me I was invisible," she said softly. "That I should be grateful for being allowed into spaces I was never meant to lead." A pause. The silence deepened, so I stopped asking for permission. A faint smile touched her lips. Not emotional, not nostalgic, certain. And I built my own world instead. The crowd erupted in applause, not loud but stunned, like people reacting to truth they could not ignore. Damien lowered his gaze slightly, because every word felt like it was written directly against his memory. Amara continued walking. Models followed. The show progressed, but Damien barely saw it anymore. He was trapped inside his own thoughts, remembering the man he used to be. The version of him who thought control was love, silence was peace, and obedience meant respect. He had been wrong about everything. When the final model exited and the lights dimmed, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted longer than expected. Cameras flashed. Critics scribbled notes frantically. Investors looked shaken, as if they had just witnessed a shift in power they didn't fully understand yet. And through it all, Amara stood at the end of the runway, composed, calm, and untouchable. Later that evening, the after-event gala was held inside a private glass hall overlooking the Seine. Guests moved between tables discussing the show like history had just been rewritten. Damien stayed near the edges again, unnoticed. That was becoming familiar now. Then he saw her, Amara stood near the center of the hall, surrounded by editors, investors, and celebrities, speaking to her with visible admiration. But she wasn't overwhelmed. She was choosing where to place her attention. And beside her stood Adrian again, speaking quietly with her while she listened with subtle ease. There was no performance between them, no forced charm, just natural understanding. At one point, Adrian gently adjusted the sleeve of her coat as she spoke to someone else. Not possessively, not romantically obvious. Just considerate. The kind of small action Damen once thought unnecessary in relationships. Amara looked at Adrian briefly and smiled. A real smile. Not the polite kind she gave press interviews. Something softer. Damen felt it immediately. That smile used to belong to him. Years ago, she had smiled at him like that before he trained her out of needing emotional safety from him. Now it belonged to someone else who had not broken her trust. That realization hit harder than anger. It hit like replacement. Damen slowly walked closer without meaning to. He stopped a few steps away from them, unnoticed at first. Adrian noticed him before Amara did. His gaze shifted slightly, calm but assessing. "You're not supposed to be here," Adrian said evenly, not hostile, just factual. Damen didn't look away. "I received an invitation." Adrian nodded once. "That doesn't mean you belong in this conversation." Silence stretched between them. Amara turned slightly then, noticing Damen for the first time that evening. Her expression did not change dramatically. No shock, no anger. Just recognition of something distant. "Damen," she said softly. Hearing his name and her voice again felt like stepping into a room he wasn't invited into anymore. He swallowed once before speaking. "Your show was..." He paused, because nothing he said would be enough. "Incredible." Amara studied him quietly. Not emotionally, observationally, like she was assessing a part of her past she had already understood and closed. "Thank you," she replied simply. Then she turned slightly back toward Adrian, continuing their conversation as if Damen was no longer the center of anything. That was the moment it truly shifted. Not rejection, not humiliation, replacement through irrelevance. Damen stood there for a moment longer, realizing something final. He had not just lost her love. He had lost his place in her world entirely. Later that night, as guests slowly began leaving, Damen found himself outside the glass hall near the River Seine. Cold air hit his face as Paris lights reflected across the water. He looked down at his hands briefly, realizing they felt empty in a way wealth could never fix. Footsteps approached behind him. He didn't turn immediately. "You stayed," Amara's voice said calmly. He turned then. She stood a few feet away, wearing a long black coat over her couture gown, her expression unreadable in the night air. Damen hesitated. "I didn't know if I should leave without saying..." "You don't need closure from me," she interrupted gently. Silence. The river moved quietly behind them. Damen looked at her properly then. "Do you ever think about us?" he asked quietly. Amara didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "I think about who I was when I loved you." That answer hurt more than a simple no. Damen nodded slowly, accepting it. "And who I became after," she added softly. "That version saved me." Damen lowered his eyes. "I loved you," he said finally, voice low. Amara studied him for a long moment. Not coldly, not warmly, just honestly. "I know," she replied. "But love without courage is just regret waiting to happen." The words settled between them like final judgment. Damen closed his eyes briefly, exhaling slowly. When he opened them again, Amara had already turned slightly away. Not leaving in anger, not rushing, just finished. "Take care of yourself, Damen," she said quietly. And then she walked back toward the lights of the venue where Adrian waited for her without impatience, without ownership, without insecurity. Damen remained by the river alone, watching, realizing that some people don't lose love loudly. They lose it quietly, when the person they once broke becomes too whole to ever return. After Paris, Damien Laurent returned to Seoul as a different man, though nobody around him would have been able to name exactly what had changed. On the surface, he still wore the same tailored suits, attended the same meetings, signed the same contracts, and moved through the same elite circles that once treated him like a standard of success. But internally, something had shifted permanently. It was no longer confidence driving him. It was comparison. Every conversation about luxury, power, or global influence eventually circled back to one name he could not escape. Amara Okoye. House of Obsidian was no longer just a fashion house. It had become a cultural force reshaping global luxury identity. In Seoul, Paris, Milan, and Dubai, her designs were no longer trending. They were defining direction. Even legacy fashion houses that once ignored her now referenced her silhouettes in their seasonal direction meetings. And Damien could feel it everywhere he went. In boardrooms where investors casually mentioned her rise as a benchmark. In financial reports where her brand was listed alongside conglomerates. In interviews where celebrities spoke about her with reverence that used to be reserved for industry legends. He had once believed influence came from power. Now he watched in silence as influence came from creation. And Amara was creating a world that no longer had space for people like him at its center. Celeste noticed his decline first. Not dramatically. Not in arguments. But in small cracks. The way he stopped engaging in conversations fully. The way he paused too long when her name was mentioned on television. The way he no longer corrected people who assumed he still had relevance in luxury fashion discussions. One evening, Celeste stood in their penthouse dressing room watching him through the mirror while he adjusted his cufflinks without focus. "You're going to ruin yourself over her," she said flatly. Damien didn't respond immediately. That silence alone was an answer. Celeste turned fully toward him now. "She doesn't even think about you." That statement finally made him look up. Not angry, not defensive, just tired. "I know," he said quietly. And that honesty disturbed Celeste more than denial would have. Because denial meant hope. Acceptance meant collapse. Across the world, Amara was preparing for something entirely different. House of Obsidian was about to unveil its most ambitious project yet. A global flagship experience space in Paris combining fashion, architecture, and immersive design. It was not just a store or runway venue. It was an artistic landmark designed to redefine how luxury brands interacted with space itself. And the architect behind it was the same man who had been quietly standing beside her through the industry's most volatile transformation, Adrian Vale. Adrian Vale had never tried to compete for attention. He didn't interrupt Amara's world. He built structures that supported it. Where others tried to impress her, he tried to understand her vision. Where others spoke loudly about ambition, he translated hers into physical reality. And that difference was what slowly began to separate him from everyone else in her life. One late evening in Paris, Amara and Adrian stood alone inside the unfinished flagship space. The building was still under construction, steel frameworks exposed, glass panels reflecting city lights from outside. But even in its incomplete state, the vision was clear. "It feels strange," Amara said quietly while walking slowly across the open floor. Her voice echoed slightly in the empty structure. Adrian stood a few steps behind her, hands in his coat pockets. "Strange how?" She looked up at the skeletal architecture surrounding them. "Everything I imagined alone is now becoming real in front of me." Adrian nodded slowly. "That's usually how success feels when it finally catches up to you." Amara smiled faintly at that, but there was something distant in her expression. Not sadness, not regret, just reflection. "When I was younger," she said, "I thought success would feel like revenge." Adrian didn't interrupt. He simply listened. "But it doesn't," she continued. "It feels like silence." That sentence lingered in the empty structure for a moment. Adrian finally spoke. "Silence is better than chaos." Amara glanced at him briefly. "Not always." There was a pause before she added more quietly. "Sometimes silence just means you've stopped explaining yourself to people who were never going to understand you anyway." Adrian looked at her then, not with admiration, but with clarity. "And Damien?" he asked carefully. The name didn't shock her anymore. It didn't shake her. It simply existed as part of a past she had already integrated. "He was part of that noise," she said calmly. "Not my silence." Back in Seoul, Damien received the invitation for the Paris flagship unveiling the same way he had received the previous one. No personal note, no emotional message. Just black textured cardstock with silver embossed lettering. House of Obsidian, Paris flagship launch. This time, however, something inside him reacted differently. Not hope. Not excitement. Fear. Because he understood now that every time he saw her again, The distance between who they once were and who they had become only grew more irreversible. Still, he went. Not because he believed anything would change, but because he could no longer stand being absent from a world where she was becoming history, without him witnessing it. Paris that night felt different from before. Less like a fashion capital, more like a cultural center witnessing something permanent being established. The flagship building itself stood like modern sculpture along the Seine, glass, obsidian steel, and gold-lit interiors forming an architectural statement visible from across the river. Guests arrived in silence, almost reverently. Even the media presence felt subdued, as if everyone understood they were entering something significant. Damien stood among them again. Same place, different weight. Inside, the space was unlike any luxury venue he had ever seen. It was not designed to impress wealth. It was designed to express identity. Every corridor reflected a different interpretation of Amara's design philosophy. Survival translated into structure, pain transformed into geometry, resilience embedded into every surface. And at the center of it all she stood. Amara Okoye wore a minimal black tailored ensemble this time. No dramatic gown, no excessive embellishment. Just precision, control, authority. Her presence alone was enough. She did not need theatricality anymore. She was the statement. The audience gathered as she stepped onto the central platform of the flagship hall. Cameras were present but secondary now. This was no longer just an event. It was confirmation of legacy. When I started, Amara said calmly, her voice carrying through the hall, I was told I should aim to fit into existing spaces. A pause. But I was never interested in fitting. A subtle shift in the crowd. Damien watched from the side, unmoving. I was interested in building. The word landed heavier than anything else she had ever said publicly. Because she had done exactly that. Not metaphorically, literally. House of Obsidian was never about clothing, she continued. It was about identity. About what happens when people who are told they are insignificant decide to design themselves anyway. Silence. Absolute attention. And once you understand that, she added softly, you stop asking to be included in rooms that were never built for you. Her eyes moved across the audience briefly. Not searching. Not emotional. Controlled. Then, for a fraction of a second, her gaze passed over Damien. No pause. No recognition of emotional weight. Just passing observation. Like a person acknowledging a distant object that no longer required interpretation. That was the moment he finally understood the final truth. He had not simply lost her. He had become irrelevant to her narrative entirely. After the event, guests moved toward private discussions. Investors surrounded her team. Journalists prepared coverage statements, and the building itself hummed with controlled chaos. Damien stayed longer than he should have again, as if staying could reverse something irreversible. Eventually, he found himself outside near the Seine once more, alone beneath cold air and city light reflections. Footsteps approached behind him again, but this time he didn't turn immediately. You still come to places you think she might look at you, Adrian said calmly as he stepped beside him. Damien finally looked at him. And you don't? Adrian's expression remained steady. I don't need to be seen by her to support her work. That sentence landed cleanly. No arrogance, no competition, just certainty. Damien looked back toward the river. She loved me once, he said quietly. Adrian nodded slightly. People don't stop loving because they change their mind, he replied. They stop when they outgrow the version of you that existed in that relationship. Damien closed his eyes briefly. The truth was no longer painful in sharp moments. It was constant now, like breathing regret. And across the glass-lit flagship behind them, Amara stood surrounded by people who finally understood her value without needing her to shrink first. For the first time, Damien did not imagine getting her back. He understood something worse. She had already left him behind, not in anger, not in revenge, but in evolution. Part 5. The Woman Who Never Looked Back. After the Paris flagship launch, Amara Okoye's life stopped being measured in success and started being measured in influence. House of Obsidian was no longer a rising brand. It had become a global system inside luxury culture itself. Universities studied her design philosophy. Governments invited her for cultural collaborations, and legacy fashion houses quietly adjusted their direction just to avoid looking outdated beside her work. But what changed most was not the world's reaction. It was Amara's distance from it. She no longer reacted to praise the way she once reacted to survival. She simply continued building, calmly, precisely, as if everything she had achieved was just the natural outcome of refusing to disappear. In Seoul, Damien Laurent's world continued shrinking in ways no financial report could measure. His companies were still stable, still profitable, still respected, but respect without dominance felt unfamiliar to him now. He noticed it in meetings first. Younger founders mentioned Amara's name with admiration, while barely acknowledging his presence. Investors referenced House of Obsidian as the new standard of luxury innovation, while comparing older brands to outdated structures. And each comparison cut deeper than any failure ever had, because he remembered a time when he could have stood beside her instead of watching her redefine the world without him. Celeste eventually stopped pretending their relationship still existed in any meaningful form. There were no more arguments about Amara, no more jealousy-filled confrontations, just silence growing wider between two people who no longer recognized what they were holding on to. One evening, Celeste finally spoke with exhaustion rather than anger. "You don't even live here anymore," she said softly. Damien didn't look up from his documents. "I'm working." She laughed once, tired and empty. "No, you're escaping." That made him pause slightly. Celeste stepped closer. "She's not coming back to you," she said quietly. "And you already know that." Damien closed the folder slowly. "I never asked her to." Celeste studied him for a long moment. "No," she replied. "But you keep behaving like regret is a form of love." That sentence stayed in the room long after she left it. Meanwhile, Amara was in Milan preparing for what would become House of Obsidian's most important global moment yet. The 10-year retrospective collection exhibition, an event designed not to introduce new designs but to display the evolution of her entire journey, from obscurity to global dominance. The exhibition would take place inside a restored historical palace, converted into a hybrid museum and runway space, merging art, fashion, and immersive storytelling. Adrian Vale remained quietly involved in its architectural finalization, ensuring every room reflected a stage of her evolution rather than a traditional exhibition layout. Adrian Vale never positioned himself as her center. Instead, he positioned himself as the structure around her growth. That difference had become increasingly visible over time. One evening during final preparations, Amara walked alone through the nearly completed exhibition halls. Each room represented a different era of her life. The basement atelier in Seoul recreated in minimalist realism, the first breakthrough designs displayed under fragile lighting, the gala moment immortalized through sculptural installations, and finally the Paris flagship era represented through expansive glass architecture. Adrian followed quietly at a distance, not interrupting her thoughts. Amara stopped inside the final hall where the ceiling opened into a vast dome of soft light resembling a night sky. "It's strange," she said softly. Adrian stepped closer but remained a respectful distance away. "What is?" Amara looked upward. "Seeing your entire life turned into something people can walk through." A pause. "It makes it feel finished." Adrian nodded slowly. "Or understood." Amara lowered her gaze slightly. "There was a time I thought I needed him to witness this," she said unexpectedly. The him didn't need clarification. Damien existed now as a historical reference in her mind, not an emotional center. Adrian didn't interrupt. He simply listened. Amara continued. "I thought if he saw what I became, it would mean something." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "But now I realize I didn't need him to see it. I needed him not to stop me from becoming it." That sentence hung in the air between them. Not emotional, not angry, just final. Adrian finally spoke. "And now?" Amara turned slightly toward him. "Now I don't need anyone to validate it at all." That was the difference. Not independence, completion. Back in Seoul, Damien received the invitation for the Milan retrospective opening. Same format, same minimal design. House of Obsidian, 10 years of becoming. He stared at it longer than usual this time, not because he expected anything different, but because he knew this was no longer an event where he might see her becoming powerful. This was an event confirming she already was. He almost didn't go. But absence for him now felt like surrender. So he went anyway. Milan felt colder in a different way. Not physically, but socially. The kind of cold that comes when you are no longer part of the conversation happening around you. The exhibition was structured like memory made physical. Guests walked through curated chapters of Amara's life, experiencing her transformation as spatial storytelling. Damien walked through each section slowly, alone. In the soul basement room, he saw replicas of her early sewing tools, worn fabric samples, and sketches she once drew at night while he slept comfortably in luxury. In the breakthrough room, he saw her first viral gown displayed under glass like an artifact of revolution. In the gala room, he saw the recreation of her staircase moment, frozen in sculptural lighting that made it feel mythological. And in every room he felt smaller, not physically but morally. Not because she had risen, but because of how unnecessary his resistance had been. Eventually he reached the final hall. The ceiling opened into light and silence, and there she was. Amara stood at the center of the space wearing a simple ivory gown this time. No dramatic embellishment, no theatrical presence. Just purity of form. Her hair was styled softly, her expression calm in a way that suggested she had already emotionally left every version of her past behind. Guests stood at a respectful distance listening as she spoke about the final chapter of House of Obsidian's journey. I used to believe survival meant proving people wrong, she said quietly. But it doesn't. A pause. Survival is when you stop needing their attention at all. Damien stood near the back of the hall. She did not look at him. Not because she was avoiding him, but because he was no longer part of what she was addressing. That distinction shattered something final inside him. After the exhibition, guests slowly dispersed into Milan's night. Outside, soft rain reflected city lights across marble streets. Damien stood near the entrance alone again when Adrian approached him. You still follow her work, Adrian said calmly. Damien didn't deny it. I don't think I can stop. Adrian nodded slightly. That's not love anymore, he said. That's witnessing consequences. Damien looked at him then. Do you think she hates me? Adrian paused briefly before answering honestly. No. That surprised him. Adrian continued. Hate still requires emotional connection. She doesn't have that toward you anymore. Silence followed. Not comforting. Not painful. Just final. Damien looked toward the exhibition hall once more. Through the glass, he could see Amara speaking with investors and designers, calm and composed, completely surrounded by the life she had built without him. So what am I to her now? He asked quietly. Adrian answered without hesitation. A chapter she finished writing before she became the author of her own story. Damien closed his eyes briefly. For the first time, he did not imagine winning her back. He did not imagine apology changing anything. He did not even imagine forgiveness, because what he finally understood was simpler and far more permanent. Some people don't lose love. They lose access, and Amara Okoye had long since stopped being a person he could reach emotionally. She had become something else entirely, a world he once stood in, and was no longer invited into. Milan had never felt as quiet as it did the night after the retrospective, not because the city had slowed down, but because something irreversible had been completed inside it. House of Obsidian's 10-year exhibition had not just showcased a journey, it had closed a chapter of fashion history that no one would ever be able to repeat. Amara Okoye was no longer being discussed as a designer who changed the industry. She was now being discussed as the standard the industry would forever be compared against. But inside Amara, there was no celebration. No emotional climax. No internal chaos. Only stillness. That was what success had finally become for her. Stillness without permission. Peace without apology. Identity without negotiation. Adrian Vale stood beside her that night as the last guests left the exhibition hall. He did not speak immediately. He rarely did when he sensed she was somewhere beyond conversation. Instead, he simply matched her silence. Adrian Vale had become something subtle in her life over time. Not a rescue, not a replacement, not even a contrast to her past. He had become a presence that did not demand anything from her becoming. And for someone like Amara, that was rarer than admiration. Finally, She spoke without looking at him. I used to think I would feel something when everything finally made sense, she said softly. Adrian turned slightly toward her. And now? A faint pause. I don't feel like I arrived anywhere, she replied. I feel like I stopped needing to run. That sentence hung between them, not as poetry but as truth. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the world, Damien Laurent was still standing inside a life that no longer responded to him the way it used to. His empire had not collapsed. His name had not vanished. But relevance had quietly shifted away from him like tide pulling away from a shore that once felt permanent. He no longer noticed when people stopped listening carefully in meetings. He no longer reacted when his ideas were compared to newer, more influential voices. What once would have triggered pride or anger now only created a distant numb recognition, because everything eventually led back to the same name, Amara Okoye. Not as a memory anymore. As a structure of reality. One evening, Damien found himself in his office long after everyone had left. The city lights of Seoul stretched endlessly outside his window, but they no longer reflected his internal state. On his desk lay a single unopened envelope. House of Obsidian. Final global closure event invitation. Not a launch, not a debut, a closure. His hand hovered over it for a long time before finally opening it, and for the first time, he did not feel like he was being invited to witness her rise. He felt like he was being invited to witness the end of his own relevance. The last House of Obsidian event was not announced as a show, exhibition, or gala. It was announced as a transition, a final acknowledgement of everything the brand had become, and everything it no longer needed. The venue stood by the Seine like a structure carved out of memory itself. Glass, obsidian stone, and soft light blending into architecture that felt less like design and more like statement. Guests arrived quietly. No. One spoke loudly anymore when it came to Amara's. World Damien arrived alone, and for the first time, he was not greeted by anyone who recognized him as important. No assistants guiding him. No investors acknowledging him. Just a man walking into a world that had already finished evolving past him. Inside, everything felt deliberate, minimal, final. And then the lights dimmed. Silence fell instantly. Amara Okoye stepped forward. She wore something impossibly simple, an ivory black structured dress. Clean lines, no excessive design. Nothing theatrical. Nothing emotional. She did not need transformation anymore. She was the final form of it. She looked at the audience, not as someone seeking approval, but as someone confirming completion. I started House of Obsidian, she said calmly, because I wanted to build something that did not require permission to exist. A pause. But I realize now, it was never about fashion. Her gaze moved slowly. Across the hall, it was about becoming. Damien stood somewhere near the back, still, quiet, fully aware that nothing in the room belonged to him anymore. Amara continued. I used to believe people needed to see me become powerful in order to understand me. A soft breath. But I don't need to be understood anymore. Silence, absolute silence. Then, for the briefest moment, her eyes passed over Damien, not with pain, not with anger, not even recognition, just completion of a timeline that no longer required revisiting. And that was when it fully ended inside him. Not her success, not her love, but his place in her existence. After the event, the guests slowly dispersed into the Paris night. The world would call it the most defining cultural moment of the decade, but for Damien it was not history. It was absence. Outside near the Seine, he stood alone as the water reflected fractured city lights. Everything around him felt real but no longer connected to him. Footsteps approached behind him. He didn't need to turn to. No, Amara stood a few steps away, not dramatically, not emotionally, just present for a moment. Neither spoke. Then Damien finally asked, quietly, do you ever think about what we were? Amara looked at him for a long time. Yes, she said softly. A pause, but only as proof that I survived something I will never return to. That answer did not hurt like rejection. It felt like final classification. Damien nodded slowly. I'm sorry, he said. Amara did not respond immediately. Not because she was thinking, but because she no longer needed to process it emotionally. I know, she finally said. Then, gently, but I don't live there anymore. A quiet silence followed, not heavy, not painful, just finished. Amara turned slightly toward the lights of Paris. No anger, no hesitation, no emotional residue, just direction. I hope you find peace. Damien, she said softly, and then she walked away, not leaving him behind, not walking away from love, but simply continuing forward in a life where she no longer needed to look back to validate anything she had become. Damien remained by the river long after she disappeared into the distance, and for the first time in his life, he understood something irreversible. She had not been taken from him. She had not been lost. She had simply outgrown the version of life in which he still mattered, and some endings are not dramatic. They are quiet, like a door closing in a room you no longer live in.